theirs was not a marriage built on fire. It was built on steadiness, on the particular comfort of two people who had chosen each other carefully and believed that choosing carefully was enough. Daniel was a man who expressed love through presence, through reliability, through the quiet architecture of a life well maintained. Claire was a woman who had once found that kind of love sufficient, even beautiful, until she began to wonder if sufficiency was just another word for settling. They had been married 9 years when Marcus Hale walked into her office and treated her like someone worth impressing. What followed wasn't a love story and wasn't quite a betrayal story either. It was something more ordinary and more devastating than both. It was the story of how a person can be slowly taught to see their life differently, and how, once you've learned to see it that way, you can't always find your way back. The kitchen in the Mercer house smelled like coffee and old wood in the mornings, and Daniel had always found that smell reassuring. He bought the house with Claire 6 years ago, during a period when they were good at making decisions together, when the language between them still had texture. He remembered standing in this kitchen the first time, Claire's hand in his, both of them measuring the light to the window like people who believed the right amount of light could matter. He made her coffee the same way every morning, 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, heated for exactly 45 seconds after brewing because she said it tasted different any other way. It was a small thing. He knew it was a small thing, but he did it without thinking, which he believed was its own kind of love, the kind that didn't require an audience. Claire worked in brand strategy for a mid-sized firm downtown. The work wasn't glamorous, but she was good at it in a way that she'd never quite let herself feel proud of. She had a tendency to minimize her own competence, to frame her achievements as the product of luck or timing, and Daniel had spent years gently pushing back against that. "You're the one who built that campaign," he'd say. "That wasn't an accident." She'd smile in the way people smile when they want to believe something but haven't managed it yet. The new department had arrived in September. Marcus Hale. Claire mentioned him the way you mention weather, incidentally, as background. He'd come from a larger firm in Chicago, brought in to restructure the creative division, younger than the previous director by 15 years. Energetic in a way the office apparently wasn't used to. "He actually listened during the pitch," Claire said one evening, seated at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She wasn't looking at Daniel when she said it. He stopped and asked follow-up questions. "Nobody does that." "I listen when you pitch ideas," Daniel said. "I know," she said, and the words were agreeable. But the tone was somewhere else. He didn't press. He was not, by nature, a pressing sort of man. He valued the spaces in a conversation, believed that silence between two people who knew each other well wasn't absence, but a different kind of speech. He'd been wrong about this before. He was aware of that. But old patterns are difficult to revise when they feel, on the surface, like virtues. Their evenings had a rhythm that had calcified slowly over the years, without either of them quite deciding it should. Dinner around 7, eaten at the table if they were both present, in front of the television if one of them was tired. Claire would usually take her phone to the couch afterward. Daniel would read or work on the small house projects he kept a running list of. They touched each other with the easy familiarity of people who had stopped needing to think about it. A hand on the shoulder, a kiss that landed near the cheek, the automatic reach for warmth that wasn't quite hunger anymore but wasn't nothing either. What Daniel didn't see, or didn't let himself see, was that Claire had started waiting for the evenings to end. She wasn't sure when this had begun. She thought about it sometimes, in the kind of half-formed way you think about things you're not ready to examine directly. It wasn't that she was unhappy exactly. It was more that she had recently been introduced to a different frequency of being seen, and now she was noticing the difference without fully understanding why she was noticing it, or what to do with the noticing. The Friday before everything quietly began its slide, Daniel had come home to find her on the phone, laughing at something. A real laugh, not the social one, and when she saw him in the doorway she didn't hang up. She held up one finger. He went to the kitchen, put away the groceries, started dinner. 20 minutes later she appeared in the doorway. Phone gone, expression slightly reset. "Sorry. Marcus was walking me through this new campaign model. At 7 on a Friday? He's very..." She paused, thorough. Daniel nodded and handed her the wooden spoon to stir the sauce. She took it without looking at him, and he stood beside her, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and old wood, and everything looked exactly the same as it always had, and he told himself that was a good thing. He almost believed it. October arrived gray and quick, and with it came the first serious cold of the season. Daniel noticed, around this time, that Claire had started dressing differently for work. Not dramatically. No one could have pointed to it and said something has changed. But there was a care to it now, a deliberateness that hadn't been present before. She blow-dried her hair on days when she used to let it dry on the commute. She came home smelling faintly of perfume she'd applied in the morning and not reapplied. He said nothing about this. He catalogued it privately, the way he catalogued most things he wasn't ready to confront. Their conversations during October felt like walking on ice neither of them acknowledged was there. They talked about the practical things, the water pressure issue in the upstairs bathroom, Claire's mother's upcoming birthday, whether they should book anything for Thanksgiving. They were perfectly fluent in the logistics of a shared life. It was the other language, the one beneath the logistics, that had gone quiet. One evening, Claire came home animated in a way he hadn't seen in months, and his first reaction, before anything else, was relief. She dropped her bag by the door and came into the living room where he was reading, and she was talking before she'd sat down. So Marcus pitched this whole experiential marketing idea to the board today, and they were resistant. Really resistant, you know how they get. But he just reframed it, like he just calmly told them a different story about the same idea, and they all but applauded. She shook her head, but she was smiling. I want to be able to do that, just reframe under pressure without flinching. Daniel set down his book. You already do that. I really don't. Claire, the alderman account. 2 years ago, they came in wanting to kill the entire campaign, and you spent 40 minutes. That was different. How? She hesitated, and in the hesitation something passed across her face that he couldn't name. Not irritation, not dismissal, but something closer to impatience, as though she were waiting for him to say something else. As though the thing she'd come in to say wasn't about Marcus Hale at all, and she was disappointed he hadn't understood that. It just was, she said, and reached for the remote. He looked at her profile in the television light. She was 37 and still beautiful to him in the way that people who have been loved for a long time are beautiful, accumulated, specific, irreplaceable. He wanted to say something that would reach her. He ran through options and found each of them either too much or not enough, and so he said nothing and turned back to his book. And the ice held. It was around this time that the phone habits changed, not in obvious ways. She didn't leave the room when calls came in. She didn't change her passcode, or at least not that he noticed, but she'd started holding her phone with a kind of low-grade alertness. Face down on tables, picked up just slightly faster than before. He'd have dismissed this entirely if it weren't for the quality of her attention when she checked it. There was a flicker, brief but distinct, the expression of someone who has been waiting for something and received it. He told himself it was work stress. He told himself Marcus ran a demanding team and Claire was invested in proving herself. He told himself these things carefully, the way you talk yourself down from a height. Because the alternative was a conversation he didn't know how to begin. They were in bed one Thursday night, not touching but close, the space between them theoretical rather than actual. When Claire said into the dark, "Do you think we're interesting to each other anymore?" He was quiet for a moment. What does interesting mean? I don't know. Do you ever feel like you could predict everything I'm going to say before I say it? Sometimes. Is that bad? I don't know, she said again. He turned his head. Her eyes were open, aimed at the ceiling. He had the feeling, obscurely, that this question was borrowed from somewhere, that it had been posed to her first by someone else, and she was now testing it in their bed to see how it sounded. I think, he said carefully, that knowing someone well enough to anticipate them isn't the same as finding them boring. I think that's what long love actually feels like. She said, maybe. He thought that's not a maybe question and didn't say it. Then Claire turned slightly and said, in a tone that was wholly unlike anything around it, I don't know. Maybe like this story, or subscribe or something. The words fell into the room with a strange, displaced weight. Daniel blinked in the dark. What? A silence. Claire blinked too, like someone stepping back from a window. Nothing, she said quietly. I don't know why I said that. He waited. She didn't add anything. The television in the spare room was on. He'd left it running for the noise, and through the wall came the murmur of voices they couldn't make out, and eventually they both closed their eyes. And the moment passed, and neither of them mentioned it again. 3 days later, Daniel found a message on her phone by accident. He hadn't been looking. She'd left it face up on the counter when she went to shower, and it lit with a notification, and his eye caught it before he could choose not to look. One line from Marcus Hale at 9:47 in the evening. You deserve someone who makes you feel like yourself. Don't lose that. Daniel put the phone face down on the counter exactly as she'd left it. He stood there for a while. The kitchen smelled like coffee and old wood. He thought that sentence was designed. He didn't know why he thought it so clearly, so immediately. But there it was, not the message of a colleague, and not quite the message of a man pursuing something physical. It was the message of a man who had studied the terrain. He said nothing when Claire came downstairs. He handed her tea. She thanked him. He smiled, and it reached his eyes because he was determined, with a quiet, deliberate will, to know what he was dealing with before he moved. November brought a particular kind of gray that Daniel had always associated with decisions. The days shortened quickly, and the house felt slightly larger than before, not because anything had moved, but because Claire's presence had developed a new quality of elsewhere. She was physically there, but her attention had taken up residence somewhere he wasn't invited. He had spent 3 weeks since the message on the phone doing something he was not proud of and could not stop doing, paying close attention. He was not by nature a suspicious man. His natural posture was to give people the benefit of the architecture, to assume that what a situation looked like on the surface was roughly what it was underneath. This had served him well in most areas of life. In this area, he was now fairly certain it had worked against him for some time. What he'd noticed over those 3 weeks was a pattern that felt designed, not the individual pieces. Those were ambiguous enough, deniable in isolation, but the shape they made together. Marcus had been positioning himself over months in the part of Claire's life that Daniel occupied least. Not in the obvious way, not through flattery or obvious flirtation, but in the register of deep listening. He asked about her history. He took her professional grievances seriously and reframed them as evidence of her capability rather than her frustration. He was available, consistently, in the emotional hours, early morning texts with articles she'd find interesting, late check-ins that ran long, and quietly, incrementally, he had begun to introduce a narrative. Daniel had pieced this together partly from things Claire said without realizing she was saying them. Small secondhand characterizations that didn't sound like her. Someone told me that men who don't communicate their needs often punish the people they love for it. Or, one evening when they disagreed about something trivial, I just feel like you need everything to be a certain way, and I'm never quite getting it right. That second sentence had stopped him. It didn't sound like an organic complaint. It sounded like a complaint that had been legitimized by someone else first. Someone who had told her, what you're feeling has a name, and the name is him. He chose a Saturday. Claire was making lunch, and he was at the table with coffee, and the house was quiet in the way that felt prepared. I want to talk about something, he said. She turned. Okay, I want to talk about Marcus. Her hands went still on the counter, just for a moment. Then she resumed. What about him? I think, Daniel said, that he's been working very hard for a long time to make you see our marriage as the problem. The silence that followed was careful. Claire put the knife down. She didn't turn around immediately. That's a significant thing to say. I know. She turned then, and her expression was something he hadn't expected. Not anger, not deflection, but a weariness that looked old, like it had been there longer than this conversation. Daniel, not everything that's gone wrong between us is someone else's fault. I know that too. You make everything about your interpretation, your framework. Even right now, you've decided there's a villain, and so now everything gets explained by that. He looked at her steadily. Tell me I'm wrong. You're, she stopped. I'm not saying he hasn't said things. What things? She pulled her sleeves down, an old gesture, one she made when she was trying to contain something. He made me feel like I wasn't invisible, she said, and she said it quietly, without accusation, which made it heavier. That's not manipulation, Daniel. That's just, I didn't realize how much I needed someone to notice me until he did. He sat with that. He'd known it was coming, and it still arrived like cold water. Do you know, he said slowly, how he chose to say that? How many conversations it took before he got there? Do you know what the shape of those conversations look like from the beginning? You're talking about him like he's calculated. I'm talking about him, Daniel said, like someone who had a goal and used what he learned about you to move toward it. Claire's jaw tightened. Or maybe he just listened. Maybe he just listened, and that felt like more than I was getting. There it was, the real thing, underneath the other things. He nodded slowly. Then that's something I needed to know. I'm not saying the marriage is over. I know you're not. I'm saying I need. She stopped. I don't know what I'm saying. You don't have to know right now. She looked at him then, with something that resembled the early version of her. Uncertain, honest, slightly lost. He felt the old pull of it and didn't move toward it. Not yet. I'm going to stay at Michael's for a while, he said. Michael was his brother, 20 minutes away. Not because I'm leaving, because I think we both need to see what this feels like. She didn't argue. That perhaps was the most honest thing that happened all day. He packed a bag that evening. She sat on the bed and watched him, not helping and not hindering. And when he picked up the bag, she said quietly, I didn't mean for it to become this. I know, he said, and he kissed her forehead and left, and neither of them knew. Yet how far away the other had already gone. The first weeks at Michael's were structured around not showing what he felt, which was a skill Daniel had always had and now recognized as part of the problem. Michael was a few years older, unmarried by choice, and had the particular tact of someone who offers presence without requiring explanation. He gave Daniel the spare room, kept the refrigerator stocked, and asked no questions. Daniel was quietly grateful. He went to work. He came home to the spare room. He called Claire every few days, conversations that were careful and orbited the important things without landing on them. Like satellites, he thought once, circling something they couldn't enter. Meanwhile, he had begun to do what he told himself he wouldn't. He documented. Not obsessively. Not in the breathless, revenge-seeking way of someone who has decided how the story ends, but methodically because he was a methodical man. And because the thing he'd seen, the shape of the pattern, had continued to unspool in his mind in quiet moments. He went back through what Claire had said over recent months. The borrowed phrases, the reframed complaints, the specific language of a woman who had been slowly given a lens she hadn't built herself. He reached out carefully to someone in Claire's office, not to spy. He was honest about his purpose. He said, I'm trying to understand what's been happening, and I need someone who isn't inside it. What he learned in pieces over the following weeks was this. Marcus Hale had done this before. Not identically. People are never identical, but structurally. A woman at the Chicago firm, a separation that followed. Marcus had positioned himself as the emotionally fluent alternative to a husband who simply didn't understand her, and had then, once the separation had become real, gradually withdrawn. He hadn't pursued anything further. He just let the vacancy he created remain empty, and moved forward with his life and his career, having left a wreckage behind him that he'd never quite touched. Daniel sat with this information for a long time. What disturbed him wasn't the discovery that Marcus was calculated. He'd known that in his gut since November, but that the calculation required almost nothing dishonest in its execution. Marcus had simply made Claire feel a particular way. He hadn't lied exactly. He just offered an interpretation of her life and her husband that she was already half ready to receive. And that raised a question Daniel found harder. Why was she half ready? He turned that over for weeks. He was honest with himself in the way people sometimes become honest when they have lost something they may not get back cleanly without self-preservation. He had provided stability. He had provided consistency. He had expressed love through action and presence and the accumulated ritual of 9 years. What he had not provided, or had provided so quietly that it hadn't registered as provision, was aliveness. He had not made Claire feel pursued. He had made her feel certain, which he had believed was better. He hadn't understood that for some people certainty, taken alone, becomes a form of being taken for granted. He was not absolved by this understanding. He held it alongside the other thing, the deliberate erosion Marcus had conducted, the targeted campaign to dismantle her confidence in the marriage while rebuilding her confidence in herself, so that she would associate her own flourishing with his presence. These things were both true at once. Daniel had contributed to a vacancy. Marcus had moved into it with purpose and intent. Claire, for her part, was managing. This was the word she used when people asked, managing, and it was accurate in the way that only partially true things are. She'd continued at work. She'd told her sister the broad strokes, edited towards sympathy. She was not lying exactly. She was choosing the version of the story that let her keep walking forward. In this version, she and Daniel had grown apart. In this version, Marcus had helped her see herself more clearly. In this version, what had happened was a natural consequence of two people who had stopped growing together. She had not yet asked herself, honestly, who had handed her that version. She missed Daniel in the middle of the night, in the way you miss things you have always had and therefore never learned to want actively. It surprised her. It arrived as a quiet ache rather than a crisis, and she managed that too. Marcus had become, in the weeks since Daniel moved out, somewhat less present. His texts arrived less regularly. He was warm when she saw him at the office, still attentive, still the version of himself she'd come to value. But the frequency had dropped, and there was something subtly different in his attention now, a quality of the theoretical rather than the immediate. She told herself this was appropriate. She told herself she didn't want him to fill the space immediately. That would have been its own kind of problem. She managed her unease with the same discipline she'd been applying to everything else. She didn't know yet what she was about to understand. That knowledge arrived in the form of a name, mentioned by a colleague over lunch in the way names are mentioned when someone assumes you already know. The woman from his Chicago office. You know, Diane, the one Claire went home that evening and sat in the kitchen, and the house was quiet, and Daniel was not in it. And she thought, what if I was given a story to believe? She sat with that question until midnight. She didn't come to the answer all at once. She came to it slowly, in the way that real understandings arrive, with resistance and revision and the particular nausea of realizing you have been careful and deliberate in service of someone else's plan. She picked up her phone. She put it back down. She thought, he'll know. And then, he probably already knows. They met at the house on a Tuesday in late January. Claire had asked to meet there because it was still technically both of theirs, and also because she needed the familiarity, though she didn't say that. Daniel arrived at 7. He let himself in with his key. She was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea she'd prepared, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and old wood. And he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the scene, and something in his chest moved toward it and then held still. "Thank you for coming," she said. He sat across from her. He didn't touch the tea immediately. She looked tired. Not in the superficial way. She was dressed and composed, but in the way of someone who has been working hard in the wrong direction for months and has recently been forced to stop and take stock. "I know about Diane," she said. "About Chicago." He nodded once. "How long have you known?" "A while." She looked at her hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't think you'd believe me, and I think I needed to know, first, whether you were going to arrive here on your own." This landed. She looked up. "That's—" She started and stopped. She had been about to say cruel. but she recognized, just in time, that it wasn't. It was accurate. And the difference between those two things had stopped being comfortable. "I've been thinking," she said, "about some of the things I said to you in November. The way I talked about you not listening, not seeing me. I've been thinking about how much of that was mine and how much of it was put there. Claire, let me." She wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for enough space to get through it without losing the thread. "I think I had real feelings underneath it. I think I was genuinely lonely in some way, and I think that's something we could have or should have talked about. But the way it got shaped, the way it became a case against you." She shook her head. "He was very good at it. He was very good at finding the thing that was real and building something on top of it." Daniel sat with that for a moment. "I know. I'm sorry," she said. And then, because she was trying to be as honest as the situation deserved, "I know that might not matter now, but I am." He looked at her. She was still the person he'd loved for 9 years. He knew her face better than he knew his own. Knew the particular ways she held tension at the corners of her mouth. Knew the way her eyes changed when she was trying not to cry. He felt the full weight of everything they had been. "It matters," he said. "I want you to know that it matters." She heard the but before he said it. "I spent a long time trying to figure out whether this was something we could come back from," he said. "Not because of Marcus. I mean, because of Marcus, yes, but not only because of that." He paused, measured. "Because of what I learned about the distance that was already there, that I helped build." "You didn't, I did," he said. "Not the same way, and not with intent. But I stopped pursuing you a long time ago. I thought I was expressing love. I think you stopped feeling it." She said nothing, because this was true, and saying so felt like a different kind of betrayal. "I don't think we get to come back from this," he said. "Not because I don't love you, I do, but because something got taken apart in this, in me, that I can't rebuild under the same roof. I don't think it would work. I think we'd be performing something." The kitchen was very quiet. "I need you to know," he continued, "that I don't want you to feel like you're leaving this the villain. What happened to you was real. What he did was deliberate. I have it documented, not to use against you, but because I needed to understand it, and because I needed you to be able to understand it someday too." She looked at him then with something that was more than grief. It was a kind of reckoning that had no clean landing place. "Did you ever think," she said carefully, "that we might have been okay if none of this had happened?" He thought about that honestly. "I think we would have kept going," he said. "I think we would have been fine. I think fine was the problem." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh and wasn't. They sat there for a while, not performing anything. He drank the tea, which had gone slightly cold. She watched him drink it. Outside, someone's car went by on the wet street, the tires making a sound like something being torn very slowly and evenly. "I'm going to go," he said finally. She nodded. She didn't ask where or when she'd hear from him or what the next step was. She understood in this moment that she had given up the right to those questions. He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He stood in the kitchen doorway again. The same doorway he'd stood in that Friday in October when she'd been on the phone. And he looked at the room and at her in it. And he held it for a moment, not with bitterness and not with sentiment, but with the plain, difficult honesty of someone who is saying goodbye to something real. "Take care of yourself, Claire." "You too," she said. He closed the door without force. She heard his footsteps on the front path, and then the car door, and then nothing. The kitchen was quiet and warm. She sat there for a long time, with the cold tea and the old wood smell, and she thought about the concept of a story that has no villain and no hero, only people who wanted things they couldn't ask for clearly, and someone who understood that and used it. She thought, "I was given a story to believe, and I believed it, and I told it to myself until it became mine." And the most devastating part wasn't the end of the marriage. It was this, somewhere in the middle of all of it. She had stopped being able to tell where the planted story ended, and her own began. She wasn't sure she'd ever fully know. Outside, the January night was clear and still. The house held its silence around her, as houses do, indifferent, patient, full of the weight of small things. Some losses don't announce themselves. They arrive the way cold does, not all at once, but by degrees, until one day you reach for warmth and realize, with quiet surprise, that you've forgotten what it felt like